Hi everyone, can I maybe get a thumbs up that everyone can hear me? Okay, we're just waiting for Mike. Oh, I see Mike, you've joined. Welcome. Okay. All right, welcome everyone to another LaRSSA web chat. Thank you, Mike, for taking time to have a web chat with us. So just some background on Mike. Mike O'Kane founded O'Kane Consultants in 1996, a company providing integrated mine planning, closure, and relinquishment solutions to the mining industry internationally. Mike is the chair of O'Kane's board of directors and continues to work within O'Kane as a senior technical advisor, using his wide-ranging technical expertise and knowledge on risk management best practices as tools for development and communication of integrated closure planning and project-specific objectives and designs. He is a recognized subject matter expert in cover systems and landform design and application of unsaturated zone hydrology and geochemistry for mine waste management. Mike is a director of the Landform Design Institute and chair of its technical advisory panel. He holds a Global ESG Competence Board designation. In 2014, Mike received the University of Saskatchewan Alumni Achievement Award for Global Development of his business and corporation and philanthropy. And he will be presenting Striving for Land Stewardship in the Mining Industry, Mine Closure as an Activity for Land Use Transition. Thank you, Mike. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen. And we can get started. Can I just do a sound check and that you can see my screen and you're just seeing the full screen?
We can. Thanks, Mike.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I really appreciate being here. I know it's you guys' lunch hour and you're spending time with me rather than doing something else. So it's very appreciated. And I also very much appreciate the invitation to be here today with you. It's really an honor. It's very appreciated. So I'm actually in Calgary, and I know it's different in different continents, different places around the world, but for us, it's interesting and it's a great learning experience to do land acknowledgement of the people who have been here for many years. In Canada, and maybe I'll just speak to Alberta in particular. Indigenous peoples have been here for well over 10,000 years. So I come from an area that Treaty 7 territory. There's unceded land in Canada as well as treaty land. And it's the traditional and ancestral territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The photo that you see on the top right is the confluence of the Elbow River and the Bow River. The Blackfoot word for elbow is mohinsis. And so people would meet at the elbows of rivers and quiet places to meet. And there's an example of that in the picture down below from the Glenbow Museum archives. So this became known, mohinsis, this meeting place became known as where we are in Calgary today. So the Kainai, the Piikani, and Siksika are part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And then there's also, it's home to the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Kokoda First Nation. And it's also the territory of and home of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and the historical Northwest Métis homeland. In Canada, there's also quite an incredible history, especially in the prairies of Métis, where it's Indigenous people as well as French-Canadian settlers. And they're also First Nations people. Now, the interesting thing to start from there is to think about how it was many hundreds of years ago. If we think about where we are today, here's a photo of an area. This is the Elbow River from the mid to late 1800s on Scotsman Hill. And if you look down that land today, much has changed with the land. You can see the downtown core of Calgary in the background. Looking to the north on the other side of that is the Bow River, and if we moved more to the right down to in the Elbow River, we'd come to that confluence that I showed you in the picture before. So this is Scotsman's Hill, generally about today. So much has changed with this land. So it's not only about land acknowledgement that land transitions and its uses change. And that's all sort of I'll start and dive into there from land transitioning with the mine life cycle. I'm a closure planning practitioner, and many of us on the call are thinking about land rehabilitation. And we often think it is very challenging to have folks that live and work in the mining industry to think about the future. But one of the places I think that would be good to start is to think about land use and how actually quite good the mining industry is of shifting land use from, say, exploration to permitting, assessment and permitting, and into construction. And each one of those shifts in land use, people are investing in one of the time frames and land use and doing work to be able to move to the next land use with eye on the next land use. It's very important to be able to have that eye on the future land use as we go from permitting and through to construction and through to operations and startup. And into operations, and then you continue to invest money because maybe there's some opportunity to expand the mine, to change your resources into reserves to a greater extent, and you invest additional money, all in the opportunity of thinking of that next future land use. And then finally, we end up starting to think about decommissioning and rehabilitation, and then that aspect of moving forward. And the missing piece here is not the idea that future land use and investing it is not important. It's that future land use following mind that we're missing. So we recognizing that land use and thinking about it and investing into the future actually has a lot of opportunity to it. It's the last one where we're thinking, well, what's the value there? Why would I want to be able to do that? What's that thread that misses our connection through time? Because the reality is, if you think about Indigenous people or people in many different places of the world, been around for hundreds, if not thousands. Here in Canada, it's 500 generations. My wife is a 15th generation Canadian. I'm just a third generation Canadian, but Indigenous people in Alberta, it's over 500 generations. And that's when we start to think more of a thought process of land stewardship. And that's the big L, and beginning our mining with the land in mind as opposed with the end in mind. Because really, even this long time frame that we see depicted on the screen here is essentially a snapshot in time. There were people here before, and there'll be people here afterwards. And so that thread across time that I believe is missing actually exists within our industry as well, to be able to account for them. If we look at a resource and reserve due diligence in NI 43-101, sort of that mining law of policy and law, as we move from resources to reserve, those factors that it would include the value of the land in the future are there. We just need to start actually bringing them in. There are no barriers to this. It's actually just using the tools that we have that exist together. Those environmental, infrastructure, social, governmental modifying factors as we go from resource to reserve. And so when we costing those preferred alternatives, it is natural that we'll do this discounting cash flow process to get our net present value of our asset. And often we have a lot of confidence about the capital that we'll put out to develop that asset in that mine. I think we have a really good idea on the net present value of the revenue discounted, and we think we might have a good idea on future costs. But I'd suggest the reality is that we have the highest amount of confidence with that capital because it's right here, it's today. Probably much less confidence in the net present value of the revenue, and I'll have a few charts to show this. But we're usually fooling ourselves, even if we leave aside any closure planning stuff, that we actually have a good idea on our net present value of our future costs, even with just our mining. We recognize that there's uncertainty, and we recognize that we need to continue to work on those and optimize. So it's natural and a natural way of life within our mining industry to move a project forward with less confidence in the future than what we have right now. And so we're just missing a bit of mindset. And I think that mindset starts with having a very strong closure vision. It's a vision that allows us to connect with the land. It's that high level aspirational description of what an owner, an operator, rights holders, stakeholders, and local communities want to achieve through implementation of a closure plan. Now, those are simple words, but they actually allow us to think in a different way, because what it means then is that closure is not a destination, but closure is actually a verb. It's an action to do to achieve a vision. It's an action to do to create a path in order for you to create a vision. And within that vision can be our future land use. And so that ends up being, when we add vision and values and principles, we can end up having really strong closure objectives. Because more often than not, when we have a different idea about an outcome of what is to be achieved, it's the difference in that closure vision and that future land use, or that returning land use. Because what we don't want to have is this most often part where it's this continuous loop of developing alternatives, identifying risks and uncertainties, studying that and reducing that risk in some way, shape, or form, modifying alternatives, and getting back to having even more alternatives. So very often closure planning ends up being this continuous loop, because we haven't connected in with a destination, the future land use, and a vision that accounts for rights holders, stakeholders, and the communities, as well as the owners and operators. So this is a great example of that. If anyone's been to Vancouver Island, and the capital of the province of British Columbia, where Vancouver Island is Victoria. And very near Victoria, there's an area called the Butchart Gardens. And I'll just sort of read this word to let you absorb it. This is from their website. And there's the Butchart Gardens on the right-hand side. It all began with one woman's vision and passion with a former limestone quarry for her backyard. Jenny Butchart envisioned landscaping a sunken garden in its place, transforming the property for her family and visitors for generations to come. So it started with a vision, and then the path was determined from there. And there's not one jurisdiction that I've worked in around the world for the last 30 years or so where there is a restriction on land use, right? And I'm just going to pick on a province in Canada that I work quite a bit in, the province of British Columbia. It's a great example in their Health, Safety, and Reclamation Code for mines in British Columbia, section 10.7.4, it speaks to land use. And what it says in there is that the land use needs to be approved by the chief permitting officer. It doesn't say everything needs to be ecological restoration. It just needs to be approved by the chief permitting officer. So there is no limitation in many, if not all, the jurisdictions with respect to land use. And now we're just even moving forward where there's an opportunity to think about and frameworks being developed for relinquishment. So here's a great position paper put out by the Intergovernmental Forum about relinquishment of closed mine sites. And they use 3 different locations. And the one I wanted to highlight to you, or jurisdictions, is in Saskatchewan. So here's a site, the Clough Lake site. It's on Treaty 8 territory and within the Métis homeland. And it's in northern Saskatchewan, on the northwest corner of northern Saskatchewan, up in the far left over here. And it's in the Athabasca Basin, where there's a lot of uranium mining over the years. It's changed over time, this operating site, from today to 20-30 years ago. And Orano, the current owner, is now looking to move this site, after about 20 years, into the institutional control program in the province of Saskatchewan. So this one's a bit near and dear to my heart, because this is one of the very first landforms that I was a part of designing and understanding the source terms and understanding protection of the receiving environment. So I designed and was part of the work of monitoring this cover system and this landform, the Cloud Waste Rock Pile, 20-25 years ago. So there's what it looked like when we started to work on it. Quite a bit of uranium and nickel. And we ended up putting in what we call an enhanced store and release cover system. So it's a cover system that has a lower permeability layer, and we use compacted waste rock material. And then we put cover material on there. So we had sufficient water holding capacity for vegetation, developed a stable landform that managed the water and surface runoff when it would occur. And that allowed to have and meet the net percolation criteria that was then protective of the environment when we thought about human health and risk assessments as we moved from a terrestrial environment and through the groundwater and into surface water systems. Here's a shot of over time of what I like early on the left-hand side and moving through time from 2008 to 2018. Very consistent, and it blends in with the surrounding topography. And so they've looked at physical stability and erosion control of the last 20 or so years, and sediment quality and water quality and surface water bodies, contaminant transport modeling, ecological and human risk assessment, and radiological clearance. So they're moving in to the institutional co-program that Saskatchewan has. It was developed in 2007. And once you've done your monitoring over time, then you can actually now understand the maintenance fund for that needs to be occurring on an annual basis, and unforeseen fund, and your mineral and your land leases are given up. And that's what's occurring here. The last license from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will run out in about a year or so. And then this program, this site, will move into Canada's Saskatchewan's institutional control program. But it wouldn't have happened without a view for the future land use for these particular landforms. On the upper one, I was involved with doing that one for the tailing storage facility, which you see in the upper left. I know it doesn't look like a tailing storage facility, but it is. And then the one on the bottom in the middle is the mine rock stockpile, the Cloud pile. So one of the inclusions that is to think about climate change and the difference between acute versus chronic. And what I mean by that is that climate and climate change it's important to think about those longer term changes. But for me, I think it's actually much more important to think about all the different potential failure modes that occur. And choosing, say, for example, SSP 5-8.5, that's often chosen because it's the most conservative, it's the most carbon emissions, et cetera. But I've got on the right-hand side a whole bunch of different potential failure modes. And, I would suggest that just because there's more rainfall more frequent rainfall events over time. Maybe for some, for stability and managing water, SSP 5.85 could lead to the highest consequence effect. But if I thought about water quality, maybe not, because now I have more water in the watershed and I have a lot of dilution. So the point here with the climate change is we think about how we can move forward with land relinquishment and a future land use, is that we have to think about probability and consequence effect to think about risk. So just because something is the worst climate change scenario does not necessarily mean it's the worst for different particular failure modes. We need to be careful there. In addition, when I think about acute and chronic, and I focus on acute, what I'm more interested in is how climate change changes climate cycling. 3 to 5 year climate cycling, 10 to 20 year decadal oscillations in climate, and how they map over each other. And maybe when I'm monitoring, say for those last 20 years at the Cluff Lake site, what climate cycle was I in? I think that's more important than just simply thinking about climate change. It's the effect of climate cycling on those acceptive climate change on those climate cycles. So now into the future, I always want to think of climate first, understanding the water balance of my landform. Then I can start to think about water chemistry, and I can start to really bring together risk from a source, pathway, and receptor perspective to be able to benefit self and bring myself to understanding returning land use. So, and returning land use doesn't not necessarily mean just ecological restoration. There's a tremendous amount of value, for example, in the materials within our tailing store facilities, residual minerals and secondary metal sources. We can turn those from liabilities into assets, and they just come about being evaluated in exactly the same way as any other resource and reserve, and evaluating the reserve that sits underground with normal mining. There's nothing new here. The process of what we would go about doing it is all entirely the same. The part that I would suggest, though, with respect to the revenue and the future costs and discounting those, is that if you thought about a closure bond that's for closure of a tailing storage facility, and then you actually thought about when I reprocess those tailings and I could create a new landform that's more geochemically, geomorphically, and geotechnically stable. Well, now I actually can have a lower financial bond for that landform. And so we need to think about how that occurs and changes the balance sheet within a company, as opposed to just evaluating the resource and the reserve in the tailing storage facilities as well. So we need to combine it. It's not just the resource and the reserve, it's how much can we actually reduce the financial assurance of the existing landform as well. And balancing all of those aspects, and then realizing there's so many success stories out there about solar and wind farms, success stories about pumped hydro storage project. This is the Kidston mine, and I'll come back to that in the future, where we're seeing the differences in elevation that we could have from two different pits, and taking power off the grid or creating yourself with a solar panel, and pumping the water uphill, and then storing it, that energy, and using that later when we move the water through the turbines from one pit to the next. Here's in the Appalachian in the United States, in the Midwestern United States, where they're doing lavender growing and foresting, harvesting on top of old coal mine spoils. And that's helping restore the lands, but that's been all capability lost through coal mining. Here's another example of an underground mine in Victoria, in Australia, the Stall mine, where they've created a dark matter underground physics laboratory with the underground workings. Here's another one in Chile where they're making high quality steel and carbon black and gas and alternative fuels from tire recycling, right? Where Cal Tires created a tire recycling place near a center of mining, and they're taking on all the tires from the haul trucks and recycling them through using thermal conversion processes. So there's lots of different success stories, right? But what's the common thing amongst, I would suggest, every single one of those? I would suggest that the common theme in every single one of those is that where we're seeing liabilities within our landforms, where we see an open pit be an asset while we operate it, but all of a sudden turn to be a liability as soon as we finish operating. Where we have our closure mindset where we only see liability, others see opportunity. Others outside of our industry see the opportunity within our own industry for future land use and the value of it. And I think that puzzle that we're waiting to solve all starts with that vision. If we thought about how we create that NI 431010 statement, or in Australia, it's called a JORC, right? Where it's the life of mine plan, the closure plan, and the basis of estimate. And if I thought about what's missing, it's returning land use, a focus on that. Returning land use is a part of closure plans, but we're not actually keeping up the closure plan to the same schedule and advancement and development as we do our life of mine plan. So if we thought of our assets as opportunities, I think we'd have a changing mindset of what actually could be the value in our future land use. And so that closure is not just seen as a liability. So we do have to understand and use the tools, in my opinion, the net present value tool. It's the tool in our industry. And perhaps the missing piece is that these aren't necessarily decision tools themselves. They're actually decision informing tools. And if you're able to create a story for each one of our net present value curves, then you're actually able to understand how they're used, how it can be used to our advantage as to what we now think about from a closure planning practitioner perspective, something that is we need to fight against because of discounting cash flows. So what do I mean by that? This is speaking to how it's often done for the asset value. They do a sensitivity analysis of commodity price changes. I think this is a gold mine, if I'm not mistaken, and changes in tonnages. And then here's that operating expense change. So here's that facet where there's a lot of sensitivity for your operating costs, not much sensitivity in the NP value for how much ore you're moving and what the cost of the commodity is. So these kind of sensitivity analyses it's very common to be done, right? But usually when we think about closure planning, we sort of say, hey, all those costs are in the future. And so the value of doing them now, it's hard to see them when we move those costs into the present. And we say, well, I'll just always do that later, right? But let's actually think of an integrated mine closure approach, right? That orange line is when I'm starting off this mine. I've got this cumulative net present value of an asset, right? So it's year zero net present value. So I've got a bunch of sunk costs, over $600 million. And then over 10 years, I have a certain amount of cash flow that essentially I get to the positive cash flow for this particular site that I want to be able to develop, this resource, this project. Now I've exaggerated the closure costs so we can actually see the dip in the value in that orange line as I've discounted that future closure costs from 25 years back to year zero on that orange line. Now, I'm not going to change anything except time. I'm going to take that brown line, the year 10 line, and I'm going to use exactly the same costs. So just because of time, without any changes in anything, right? all of a sudden, my net present value of that project goes from $400 million to $900 million, right? Because now my sunk costs are gone, those capital expenditures are gone. And I'm assuming I have no sustaining capital that I put into the system, or it's included as operating costs, right? But that closure cost, which I've given it a bigger number so we can see it, it still comes into perspective that drops the net present value down below 800. Now, eventually you really start it. Here's at year 20. I'm going to start to really have to think about closure, that blue line. Right? And then if I actually committed all that closure expenditure over time, that's that light blue line where I've realized the closure costs. So naturally, if you did this, you'd say, well, man, I don't want a negative net present value, right? So I call this pivot point, is running these NPV scenarios, right? To be able to say, is this one better than that one? Because I don't want to ever reach that pivot point. I want to know and see what it's coming. And so I always want to know, when is the value that's in the ground worth less than the liability of the assets above ground, that closure liability, and never reach that pivot point. And so in just the same way, when we want to make a decision, when we have an open pit, a resource that we would mine with an open pit, or a resource that we would mine underground, and you're trying to decide when you switch from one to the other, do we do them together? Do we do it 10 years from now, 5 years from now? It's very common for us to flash forward and say, if I did it at year 10, well, I'm going to have all this infrastructure and capital spent. Would it be better to go underground then? What if I did it at year 5 and I could get to that cash flow sooner? Is that better? So we do this all the time. We just need to do it for closure planning. It's quite simple. We don't need to throw out the net present value tool. So how do you decide the best post-mining future land use? It's all about future and returning land use. Don't be afraid to put ourselves out there of what could be possible in the future. And then we can create the highest ecological and or economic value. And that requires strategic planning right from the start, understanding what our returning land use could be and incorporating that in. I'm repeating myself here because I just think it's so foundationally important. We absolutely need a vision for closure so that we make closure an integrated part of mine planning, and we make closure an everyday occurrence in changing the culture at our mine sites. And we have strong closure objectives that we steward ourselves to. So if we begin with the land in mind and recognize that then that allows us to incorporate these modifying factors with the land in mind, not just closure. Again, I break these up into the different components of the life of mine plan, the closure plan, which includes the schedule, the returning last units and residual risk, and the basis of estimate, the LOM cost model, and the closure plan cost model. Those puzzle pieces, when we fall down, it's very often the closure plan that gets left behind. And we're not updating that nearly as often as we should be in order to maintain alignment with the law. And therefore, a closure cost model starts to fall behind. And it's that returning land use piece that we're missing. If we thought about the value of the returning land use, then we would be actually keeping the closure plan in step with the mine plan and be integrated. So that's that life of asset stewardship through integrated mine closure planning, where we can focus on asset value in just the same way as we do operations. We spend a lot of time and money and effort on our assets at our mine sites, maintaining them, thinking about the future, what's their salvage value, and so on and so forth. But we probably spend far less of that, of thinking of the value of our assets that are outside of those. But these still can be assets. And I'll give you an example of that. This is the Kidston Gold Mine. In the background is the tailings storage facility. In the foreground is a couple different pits. There's one you can see in the middle right here that's a little bit backfilled. That's this one here. No, I'm sorry, this one here. So this is a cool site. I was actually part of designing the store and release cover systems on top of the mine rock stockpiles here back in the mid 1990s. And at that time, they were mining this pit and taking the tailings and waste rock from that and putting it in to the first pit. A great way to manage metal leaching and acid rock drainage. Now, it first started in the 1900s, open cut, 1920, and then started from 1979, and it continued until 1995, and then it was closed again in 2001. Now, really cool is that on top of the tailing storage facilities, they created a 50 megawatt solar farm in 2017. A $9 million federal grant, $125 million capex that's connected into the national energy market. Now, why did they do it on the tailing storage facility? Well, it was nice flat land, right? But what did we do on top of our mine rock stockpile? Right? We created these hummocks and whatnot to manage erosion and all that sort of stuff. Can you imagine the additional surface area that could have been available if we actually thought that there's potential to actually put solar panels on top of the mine rock stockpile as well as on top of the tailing storage facility, right? We would actually have a larger solar panel grid to tie into the national electricity market. So I'm not saying what was done here, we did here was wrong. I was part of doing it. I thought it was fantastic, right? But if we thought about that future land use, would I have changed the closure plan? And I'm going to really even push that. They now have the Kidston Pump Storage Project. It'll be commissioned in Q1 of 2025, 250 megawatts. And it's just basically taking the difference between Wise's Eldridge Pit and Wise's Hill Pit and the differences between those two, having underground tunneling system and the powerhouse and the turbines in order to create the generation of power and the storage of power, pumped hydro, between the two different pits. But if you thought about it and think about going all the way back here, if you knew you were doing pumped hydro storage as you were developing that mine, there's a couple things we'd ask to think about we do. Would this been the best thing to do? Is backfill that open pit with rock from here? Or maybe could we actually created a different mine rock stockpile to create more energy space and space for solar panels and more pumped hydro capacity because we have larger reservoirs. And in fact, I'm going to really push it. The mines stopped mining because the ore grade wasn't economic. But what if the ore grade became economic because we wanted to create a bigger pit for pumped hydro storage? And that non-economic gold turned into be economic gold because we had an eye on future land use. So my point in telling us that, saying that to us, is that right now, these are fictitious curves, but you could argue that at some point in time, there was some sunk capital in the past at the mine site, and then there was a positive net present value, and they created the project. And just like in the before, you move forward in time, the net present value of the project increased. At some point in time, they sunk some capital into it and operating costs to create the closure plan. And then somebody sunk some capital, got some funding to create the Kidston Solar Project. And then somebody's also found some cash and leveraged the cash that was put in before and built off of that for the pumped hydro storage project. Keep in mind, these are just fictitious curves, but I'm trying to depict the point. Can you imagine if we actually started off with the Kidston Gold Mine solar pump storage project? It'd be completely different. We would have taken advantage of every single piece of capital spent and infrastructure and leveraged off it, just as we do when we operate mines and expand mines, and just as it was done going from the solar panel project to the pumped hydro storage project. And so that's the vision that I would have, is if we have this future land use that doesn't necessarily need to all be ecological restoration, but it needs to have a big point of that, the opportunities are endless. So the summarizing discussion here is that there's opportunities with returning land use allows us to focus on that there's not a lack of code. There's a lack of code to be able to do this. Land use can be something more than ecological restoration. And it's an and, it's not an or. We work in the ecological restoration for other different parts of the landforms on the mine site. There's probably some enhancements that are needed to be done for sure, but there shouldn't be the barriers that we think they are. And when we think about that returning land use discussion, then we actually can use the NPV dual to find our financial pivot points and then say, what could be better? What could I do now in order to make that financial pivot point not occur, or actually utilize the capital expenditure now in order to plan for the future and a better outcome into the future? And changing our mindset of our assets not being liabilities. And all of a sudden, as closure comes, all of a sudden, for example, an open pit becomes a liability, whereas for years before it was an asset. If you like some of the sketches here, here's some connect details for the gentleman here. Daryl Shuttleworth, he's not only a gentleman, he's also a very gentle and very kind man. You'd love working with him. I encourage you to reach out to Daryl. You can have a look at his website at www.dshuttleworth.ca. He's got a lot of his artwork and all kinds of different kinds. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. Excellent discussion. The floor is open for any questions or comments. Just raise your hand so I can see, and then okay. Divan, see your hand is up.
Thanks, and afternoon, Mike, or good night. I'm not sure where you are. You're probably good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Divan from EXM, and I like your MPV graph. But the one question I have is, you're focused a lot around the vision as being the starting point to this. And if we're looking at South Africa or a lot of Africa, we're a developing country, and the asset lives are quite long. So the vision right now might be something like food security, but in 50 years' time, our vision might be completely different because we're actually not at a point where we've transitioned to a first world country. Is there a pivot point in time or something that triggers us to reevaluate our vision? Or do you believe we can have one vision that's generic for life? But I'm worried that might be just too generic then possibly.
Yeah, I think we, as we learn, we should be changing the, like it's the principle of the vision, and that might change over time. The vision is to say that this is land stewardship, not land use, right? And if I had that, and then I'm saying I'm gonna pivot through time, right? This may be a silly example, but where I live in Calgary, it used to be farmland, and then it was transitioned to be ranch land. And then it was transitioned to be a conservation area. And eventually somebody convinced the landowner and the city got together and they got some permitting together and they changed it into a residential land use. So neither one of those land uses from before were wrong, but it was how the vision changed for the use of that land. But the principle of having a vision, I think, is really important. And I think also, just to pick up, we have if I understand the situation you described, is that we have a very, very similar case in many parts of Canada where food scarcity and the access to food and the cost of it is phenomenal. It's a big issue in many remote communities in Canada. And if you can imagine and think that rather than, and it's hard to grow things there. So, think about using the power purchase agreements that exist at our mine sites and enhancing them. And rather than having those be taken down and the infrastructure, could we use it, say, for vertical farming, where we're putting the vegetation, the fruits and vegetables that we want to be able to grow inside, modular vertical farming with conserving water and cycling it around. And my point being is that there are lots of opportunities to think of these landforms, but whenever we do closure and we say, hey, we're out of here, like what gets taken away? It's the power infrastructure, but that's an incredible asset for future land use. And it doesn't even need to be any fancy land use, but that food scarcity is something that we struggle with in Canada as well. And I think there are some solutions if we use our land and our infrastructure that we've got at hand.
Right, thanks very much, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Thanks. And then I see Farnes, you also have a hand up.
Hi, good morning. Mike Farnes from Greenco. Thank
Hi.
you for your inspiring talk. Always enjoy these. Yeah, I've got so many questions. Anya, I'm only limited to one. I could pose three.
You can. Go ahead, Farnes.
Okay, so Mike, I think first off, in terms of a closure certificate, you were saying that people getting out of the mine. How many examples, or are you aware of final closure certificate where the land has been relinquished completely? And then to what extent does a third-party land manager, do they take the land over and oversee that? And then the question I have on the back of that is, who takes then the liability of the land once the mine is not the owner? Because we're sitting with a challenge that the liability remain with the mine owner. And, if you want to collateralize any post land use, who collateralize on the back of what you collateralize that activity? On the back of the mine's balance sheet, or you get external financing? The examples that you've shown, basically, you had federal grants, you had, alternative sources of finance. But for these projects to work, obviously you need to collateralize that with investor money, or the mine need to put the money forward. So I wanted to know, in terms of final closure, examples of those. And secondly, about your opinion of who carries liability once, the site has been relinquished and perhaps the closure fund has been depleted. And thirdly, I wanted your opinion on the involvement of the regulator in this whole process. Because goalposts move along, and to incentivize mines to invest in this is often a challenge. So maybe you could talk to those 3 points. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So that's lots there. Okay, and I want to start off with saying I don't have all the answers, but I'll try. Now, the Cluff Lake site is a site like that's moving forward, that's transitioning, right? As far as I understand, there's the land and the responsibility for managing water and water quality at the Kidston site has transferred from the mine owner to the people who are actually managing that and using that land right now, right? And you think about, so how did that occur? Let's use Kidston as an example, right? How did that occur, right? Well, that occurred because there was an agreement on land use, and there was an agreement on acceptable level of residual risk, because there was agreement on land use and over time. I can't reach acceptable level of residual risk in order to transition the land, because there will always be a residual risk, right? Unless I actually really understand what the land use. So I think the system falls down when we don't actually do exactly what we do every day. So I'll go back to my simple example here. When I purchased the home that I'm in, I'm very fortunate to be able to have done that. But the bank checked me out. They said, hey, do we think Mike has enough money and his family and, cash flow and all that kind of stuff against the mortgage and the house and the value of the house, right? And then I checked them out. I said, hey, is it a good interest rate, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of checking out. But at the end of the day, I signed one paper and they signed one paper that said, we agree that there's an acceptable level of residual risk for me to take on this mortgage and you to be able to loan me that money, right? And it's all because we have an understanding of what the land use of this particular, of my house is and where my home is, right? And I think that's the missing piece, is that we think that this closure activities work because somebody has to give money, the mining company, right? And I think there is federal grant and federal money that should be taken advantage of to encourage new economies, right? But it's also having the mining company not say that I'm going to take away this infrastructure. Those actually could be part of the package, the value of the land. And the most valuable piece very often are infrastructure to deliver power, energy, and infrastructure to be able to have, even if it's a power purchase agreement. So those are the things that I like to be able to focus on in order to be able to find out that acceptable level of residual risk. It fails if we think that the only way it's going to work if somebody's going to find some magical grant and money, right? Because it needs to survive just like any other business needs to survive, right? And there's lots of examples of failures where somebody has taken on land, right? But I'd argue that's not because, you know, they took on land and were given money. It failed because the business wasn't actually run properly, or it didn't have a chance in the first place. So I think if we just think about it as a business, just like any other one that has problems with cash flow and all that kind of stuff, you're looking for funding and all that sort of stuff and investments and investors. So I think it can be done, and it is being done. Very few sites, and it will go to things like the institutional program in Saskatchewan, and it will go into institutional investment funds that people want to get into, solar panels, wind farms, of thinking of that in those new energy, vertical farming. There's people who are investing in that sort of aspect, provided they could get good power purchase agreements. So I think it's investment funds, and maybe the mining company is part of investing into that. And then there's, just like any other investment fund, just like any other aspect, there's a trust that needs to be created. And then there's somebody who's employed to manage that land, whether it's the future owner or the community and whatnot, to manage that. So there's a lot of capacity training, right, to be able to do that. And it's not just capacity training to go stick a pH monitor into water. It's capacity training how to manage contractors, how to actually develop a contract and do procurement, and how to manage a site and run a business. So I don't think it happens overnight, but to me, that's the path forward to be able to do this. But we're literally at its infancy right now, I think. I hope that helped.
Thanks, Mike. I see there's another hand up. Catherine?
Hi, Mike. Thank you for the great talk and also the positive spin on, you know, what land rehabilitation can do. I wonder if you can offer some advice. At the moment, I'm in the position where I'm lobbying a Canadian company about who are about to start mining platinum in South Africa, to take a land stewardship, you know, perspective in South Africa, instead of just doing a tick box exercise. You know, are there any policies or guidelines from Canada that you think we could refer to and say to them, you know, please, we need to have best practice here. Just because we're in Africa doesn't mean, you know, you just pay a bribe and go ahead and do what you want. I'm not, So I don't know if you can offer any advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's, I think perhaps the advice I could offer is, you know, I'm stepping on our bounds. I don't know all the details of it, but I think that there's many aspects, such as the GISTM, the Global Institute for Tailings Management. There's the Canadian Dam Association. There's the Mining Association, the Mining Association of Canada, and their TSM, their Towards Sustainable Mining framework. There's the ICMM, the International Council of Mining Metals. I think has great stewardship and guidelines. And there's also individual jurisdictions, like one of the, I believe is one of the most progressive and strongest jurisdictions for having regulatory guidance that's similar to what you're talking about is in British Columbia. They have some of the most amazing people working in the regulatory environment for different agencies in British Columbia. They're just an absolute pleasure to work with. So I think there's lots of places to draw upon. But I also think that I could offer something that maybe is a bit simpler, but not so simple as it loses the complexity, I hope, is that land stewardship is, and I'm gonna do the big L, right? So land equals the water and the flora and the fauna and everything, if that's okay. And when I say land stewardship, that's the big L, and I think you know more than that, more about that than I would. There's a project that I'm working in Australia, and the traditional owners have long said that they want to go back to do cultural uses for the land, fishing and hunting. The mining company would really like to be able to just have the land all go back to being cattle grazing. Well, those are two completely different land uses. And the traditional owners aren't opposed to the cattle grazing. They're just saying we don't want it everywhere. But what it leads to is a water quality criteria guidelines, that are different. Drinking water quality guidelines are different than for cattle grazing, stock water use, right? So therefore that results in a different closure plan and a thought of what water could look like in the future. So I think if you were able to think about that, what are the water quality guidelines going to be used in the future and during operations and after the mining company is done? And that stems from the land use. That's a great way to be able to help hold the line and say, okay, it's not so much about what the water quality is now and what's going to be, but what's the land use going to be used in the future. And that will allow you to be able to help guide the closure plan so it ends up not being just a fenced in, non-use management area, and then everything outside it is something that might end up coming to look like good water quality into the future. And I think that's the way of stewarding towards that and continuing to have that of challenging them as what's the future land use going to be, and then not potentially falling into the trap and allowing them to fall into the trap and say, well, there is no water quality guideline for that land use. It can only be stock water, and say, well, let's get together and start creating those water quality guidelines for traditional land use. So that's the thing I think that somebody can do right away, because the maximum foreseeable loss for the mining company is that people in the community and the regulator don't accept their closure plan. Then they'll be there forever. But think about it the other way. The maximum foreseeable loss for the community is they don't get back onto the land and use the land. And I think if it comes from that perspective, instead of thinking, how do I reduce uncertainty, find out what's the most certain thing to occur and work backwards from there. And I think it really always comes back to water and land and land use and water use. So I hope that helps. And there's all those other jurisdictional things as well, I think.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Divan, yes.
Thanks, Mike. I'm just thinking of considering your MPV graph. You currently realize the economic value of the post-closure land use only after closure. But if you do concurrent mine rehabilitation, you'll have that alternative economy taking place duly with mining at the same time. An example, grazing with livestock at dump while you're still expanding your pit, or in coal the same. where in your NPV graph will you realize that value? Will you try and realize it with the mining as dual land use economies, or only afterwards have like a head start, I guess?
Yeah. So Devin, you've hit on, I would say, is my dream, right? It's to not separate these things out. And I didn't do a very good job of explaining that in that last chart with the Kidston pumped hydro solar panel thing, right? Like I think that as you would finish a waste rock dump, a mine rock stockpile, is like, why wouldn't you start putting solar panels on them? Or if you finish an area of a tailing storage facility in a mine rock stockpile, why wouldn't you start cattle grazing, right? I just think that's 100%. And that's why, and this is just me, right? I would love if we actually change the word from progressive reclamation and closure to coalescent land use. I think that word coalescent is a much more powerful word that describes exactly what you described. And it's actually where we want to actually be, is coalescent land use. And then we're actually doing the work all together. It's not this progressive closure and reclamation, that we're actually doing it's very integrated. So it's actually a coalescent land use, and looking to try and actually do it at the same time, and having the value of the future land use come into play much, much sooner. Yeah, love that, Devin.
Thanks, Mike. I think I need to come and see you. I've got 100 questions, but it's great talking to you. Thanks, Anya.
Well, the really interesting thing is, if you think about the first 4 letters in the word coalescent, it's coal, right? So it fits a lot of different ways, things, right?
I like that plan. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Anya?
Yeah,
Your question?
Anya. Sorry, there's 2 Anyas here. For me, my takeaway here is, I think we need to upskill the mining personnel as well, because their core way of seeing the operation is mining, and the decision makers usually don't have the vision to look for partnerships in getting sustainable end land use initiatives off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to look at upskilling for the future mine or land users, and utilize the training departments which we have, which is usually ISO accredited kind of training facilities to assist in training people in the future mine use. And I really want to thank you for the nice insight in this, and hoping to hear much more from you. Thank you very much.
That's very kind of you. And Anya, I couldn't agree with you more. Like, there's a lot of time in mining, we think, you know, hey, we're going to do some costs for somebody who can take care of it in the future. And you know, one of the questions that I think we should be comfortable saying is, like, can you be a little bit more specific? Who is going to take care of it? Where's the training going to come from? Right? And they say, oh, they'll hire somebody. Well, I sort of mentioned that. Okay, well, hiring somebody and procuring somebody and managing somebody, that in itself is an incredible skill set. Not everybody can do that. So where's the capacity training for that? Right? So I think you're exactly right. There's some upskilling and training on all the parts, and doing that sooner than later. The other part I wanted to suggest to you as well is that again, I'm a closure planning practitioner, so I can say this, is that, you know, through my career, I've spent a lot of time wondering, like, why won't that person do this? I don't get it. Don't they see the value, right? And I've tried to learn to stop doing that. And what I've tried to learn to do is, rather than creating a me versus them, I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to move to them. I'm not going to expect they're going to move to me to understand me. I'm going to move to them and understand their constraints and priorities and what drives their everyday. So I often have a bit of a joke here. I say, you know, you need to become the best friend forever with your mine planners. Because it's not the mine planners that are making the mistake. They just have their own constraints, right? As like anybody else. But if you understood them more, then you'd actually see, how can I better communicate with them in order to then have these conversations that you're talking about? So the upskilling part, a lot of it is just, and you know, people think it's innovation and stuff like that. The barrier for that upskilling and the barrier to connect is ourselves, right? And I'd rather be the person who moves to somebody and helps them rather than waiting for somebody to come to me and see my perspective. So I think I 100% agree with you. And the part that I'd add to it is, let's move to them and understand them first, and then they'll be appreciative and they'll start to understand me.
Thanks, Mike. Any other questions? I'm not seeing another hand up. Mike, can I maybe ask you to pop your email just in the chat? Sorry, I do see a few hands up again. Wiseman and then Farnes. Wiseman, you're still on mute. Still on mute. Okay, Wiseman, please maybe just type your question in the chat, and then we'll continue to Farnes. Thanks.
Hi again, Mike. I just wanted your opinion whether you think that land stewardship, whether that penny is dropped at C-suite level at mines, or whether this is just sort of packaged under ESG. And I do think the mining industry is more serious about sustainability. But I just wanted your thoughts on whether this is becoming more discussions about risk, and whether this is being priced more aggressively and, you know, at a cost per ton level. So maybe a bit of a tight question, but within your sort of realm and experience, do you think that there's momentum in changing things around in this space?
Yeah. So I think the answer is, I'm not convinced that it's at the board level just yet. I actually had this very same question. I host a podcast for the Landform Design Institute. I'd make a plug. If anybody wants to join the Landform Design Institute, individual members are only $10. And maybe I'll find the website for that too and pop it in here. And I'm fortunate that O'Kane Consultants allows me to volunteer my time to the Landform Design Institute. So the podcast is Getting Closure, and you can find it on the website. And I did ask us the next we have a few podcasts that are waiting to come out, but one of them is I asked Priscilla Nelson that same question. Priscilla is the director of the Tailings Center at the Colorado School of Mines, and it's a joint sort of consortium between Colorado State and the University of Arizona. Priscilla is an amazing woman. And I asked her this exact same question, and she goes, no, I don't think it is, but it is happening. But we're not even sure if we have the right training in place to be able to have that, you know, and bring that to the C-suite people. So that's one way to answer it. I often ask this question to my older brother as well. And on the Landform Design Institute annual general meeting, Kevin O'Kane, my older brother, who spent 40 years with BHP and then a number with a few other mines, and now he sits on a few boards of different mining companies. So he has that perspective. He's reported to boards and now he's on boards. And I've asked him this same question. He says it's not quite there yet, but it is coming. But there's another perspective, is that if you look at ESG, it's a little bit unfortunate that the E in ESG has started to turn into just be about emissions, right? Instead of environment, right? And so I think there's a bit of a you know, we've lost our way a little bit with the ESG. So I like the focus on sustainability goals. I think they're stronger from my perspective, and they're also part of UNDRIP, the United Nations, and different companies are adopting them, like in Canada. And then you have free, prior, and informed consent. So I like that more. But I don't think the concept of land stewardship is quite at that C-suite level. But I'm not and into the boardroom. But I have limited line of sight. It's what you asked, that question is exactly what I ask all the time. Yeah, it's a great question, and I probably the right answer is I don't know, and I hope that provided some insight for you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Wiseman, your hand is still up. I don't know if you want to try. Vonnis, your hand is also up.
Can I continue?
Yes, sure.
Hi, Mike. We've got probably north of 400 TSFs in South Africa, and we have no topsoil. I think only 6 facilities are covered. So I don't think this is a unique problem. And I think, you know, coal discard dumps are covered under 300 mils if the topsoil is available. And, you know, I do think this is a challenge. So I wanted your thoughts on that. And I mean, obviously we can try and make soil of tailings, but the perception is that once we fix the dumps, you know, they can produce at similar levels than, you know, agricultural land, and that there's huge knowledge gaps there. So perhaps share your advice, and then I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon again.
Yeah. Not sure if how much I have to offer. I do like your thought about making topsoil. I think that's fantastic. You know, takes a lot of energy though. You know, biochar, for example, takes a lot of energy. And so we need to have an energy source. And again, I think it comes to land use. You know, is it acceptable to have that landform looking like that, or you know, who's accountable for it, who's responsible for that land? I think that if somebody and your comment about a lack of topsoil is I think that exists everywhere, where there's always a lack of topsoil in different places. So I don't know quite on the answer. The only part that I would suggest to you is that it's phenomenally site specific, right? Like we can offer generalities of how you'd go about doing it, but I think the opportunities to create topsoil and create those building blocks for eventually, you know, restoring and having a functional ecosystem that you'd be happy with, whatever that might look like. You guys know much more how to define that sort of thing than I would do. It's phenomenally site specific, but I do think a lot of it comes from, if we have to make topsoil, you just have to have energy. You have to have some power to be able to actually do that. You know? So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer on that one.
Thanks, Mike. Any other questions, comments? Not seeing any more. So Mike, thank you. I see you did pop your email into the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out, please feel free to reach out to Mike. And yeah, thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the time that you took to do your excellent presentation.
You're very kind. Thank you, Anya. It was an absolute pleasure. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you guys and follow you guys and see what you all are doing as well. Thank you so much for this. It's very, very kind of you to invite me and take your time. We're going to have it for an hour and 15 minutes, and that's very generous of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Bye for now.
Bye.